Now, the Commonwealth People's Forum, as you know, is held every 2 years. And this is alongside the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, or CHOGM for short. And it brings together civil society representatives from across the 56 Commonwealth countries. Now, in 2024, this gathering will be hosted by the beautiful Pacific Island nation of Samoa. And it's important to note here that it is the first CHOGM to be held in a Pacific small island developing state. Now, the Commonwealth People's Forum 2022 in Rwanda brought together over 250 delegates, including civil society leaders, policy and decision makers, thematic experts, lawyers, journalists, academics, and activists from across the Commonwealth. Participants discussed, debated some of the big issues of our time, and more importantly, made calls for a range of key outcomes that reflect the needs and aspirations of the people of the Commonwealth. Now, a big thank you to those in the audience that have already shared their feedback and reflections in the Google Doc on the outcomes that were agreed upon last year. So what were those outcomes? Well, they emphasized the urgency of strengthening health services backed by increased funding. Well, there was a particular focus on recognizing the voices of marginalized groups, elevating the role of women in leadership positions, and representation within healthcare decision-making processes. And for those of you who were there, I'm sure you can remember there was a strong emphasis on the need for greater government commitment to transition to low-carbon economies, greater support for climate-vulnerable countries in accessing climate finance, and meaningful debt relief. We also saw a call for urgent financing for health and climate-related needs, coupled with innovative tax solutions, greater South-to-South cooperation, transitioning to renewable energy with private sector support, and reforming unjust global financing systems in the global north being underscored as the essential steps towards a sustainable future, which is what we all want. And as for journalists like myself and civil society, it was clear there was need for increased cooperation to preserve independence, enhance civil society participation in decision-making spaces within the Commonwealth, and greater engagement for young leaders in policy dialogue, as well as recognition of diverse local actors and the expansion of accountability mechanisms within the Commonwealth. Well, these are bold and impactful calls to action, but we need to pause and take stock of the last 12 months and ask a few questions. What progress has been made on these recommendations? And what more needs to be done to accelerate action on the issues of health justice, climate justice, the freedom of expression, and Commonwealth reform? And how can member states, the Commonwealth, and civil society work together to advance commitments to address these global challenges? Well, today's critical conversation marks the beginning of a series of Commonwealth-wide conversations leading up to the People's Forum in Samoa, which is next October. Our goal is clear, and that is to ensure that voices from every corner of the Commonwealth are heard and that they help us shape the discussions that will take place in Samoa. Though we're not able to answer questions during the discussion, you will have a chance to make your contributions in the breakout rooms in the second half of the event. And just a quick technical note, please make sure you have installed the latest version of Zoom Desktop to ensure the smoothest experience during our breakout discussions. We have had over 600 participants registered to attend today's event, so we'd love to know who you are. Please add your name and organization to your Zoom ID so that we can see who's in the room. And feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat, which I can already see you're at that already. Now, let's begin today's conversation by reflecting on the progress that has been made since the People's Forum 2022. We are excited to welcome our esteemed panel of speakers, all of whom attended the People's Forum and the Heads of Government meeting last year. I begin with Harjit Singh, a global expert on the issues of climate impacts, migration, and adaptation, and he serves as the head of global political strategy at the Climate Action Network International. We're also joined by Dr. Ravi Rannan-Elia, who's the executive director and fellow of the Institute of Health in Sri Lanka. He is a physician and economist with expertise in a number of areas relating to health systems, equity, and health financing and policy. Nuong Phalong is a journalist, a writer, gender activist, and actor from Ghana. She's a member of the Affirmative Action Coalition, and her work aims to highlight the urgent need for policy reform to put more women in politics and governance. And last but not least for this particular session is Tijani Christian, a youth development advocate who served as the former chairperson of the Caribbean Regional Youth Council and former chairperson of the Commonwealth Youth Council. In 2016, he received the Queen's Young Leaders Award for his work to promote sustainable livelihoods through community farms. So let's get right into it. Harjit, let me begin with you. You came out quite strongly on the issue of loss and damage during last year's CPF, and essentially said the global north is living in a bubble and is not aware of the scale of loss experienced, especially by vulnerable developing states. Now, when you think back on that statement, has that changed? And beyond that, is there anything to celebrate in the climate justice space in terms of successes since CPF 2022?
Hi, Victoria. Lovely to share the panel with you, and thank you to the Commonwealth Foundation for having me again. And thank you for reminding those words at the last forum. Indeed, we have been able to break that deadlock and the perspective with which rich countries were living in and had been ignoring the demands of developing countries when they continued to share how they were losing their farms and income and infrastructure to increasing climate impacts. And there was no mechanism at the international level to help them recover from climate impacts. You know, for the audience to know that we always focused on mitigation, which means emission reduction, then we started talking about adaptation, which is preparing. But what about people who are already facing the devastating impacts of climate change for no fault of theirs? For us, it's a matter of climate justice. And that's why we fought for it. And the good news is that after fighting for 30 long years, we finally had a breakthrough at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, where a decision was taken to establish the Loss and Damage Fund. And over the last 8 months now, we have been working with the Transitional Committee to design the fund. And on 4th of November, just a few days ago at Abu Dhabi, a decision has reached to design the fund in a manner that's going to help communities. Of course, it's a mixed bag. We are not happy with every bit of it, but we are hoping that the decision is going to be now adopted at COP28, again in the next 2 weeks. And that is going to create a system that will help people now recover from climate impacts. And it's a new role now that we have to play to make sure that the fund is fit for purpose and not a tiny one, just a couple of $1 million, because the needs have now reached to hundreds of billions of dollars annually in developing countries alone. So it's a breakthrough, but work in progress, and we will continue to fight to make sure that people get support, you know, as per their needs.
Thanks, Harjit. Let's shift to health reform. Ravi, let me bring you in here because we saw participants at CPF 2022 calling for stronger health services, of course, with better funding. Now, what are some key developments and progress on UHC or universal health coverage since 2022 across the Commonwealth that you've noticed? And how can governments ensure that funding is adequate? We heard Harjit talk about it can be a few couple of dollars, millions of dollars. It has to be in the billions. But how do we ensure that it's adequate in terms of funding?
I think, as you mentioned, these issues both of expanding health coverage, but also improving financing for health coverage, because ultimately it has to be paid for. Those are the issues that came up last year And I think also the importance of public financing, in particular taxation. Now, I think it's a bit difficult to say right now, after a year, what's happened. I mean, I think we probably have to wait some time to see the information, the data to come through. A couple of things I would, though, flag, which may turn out to be really positive developments. I would flag, for example, I think the relaunch of the National Health Insurance Scheme in Kenya. And I think we're just going to have to wait and see whether that works better than the previous efforts, but it may well be a highly positive development. I'd also just flag the appointment of a new leadership team in Nigeria, led by Mohammed Pate, who a Nigerian physician who's been very active internationally, but I think it's really been good to see him go back home, and I think hopefully contribute to taking things forward in Africa's largest country. So I think those are two positive developments. I think more generally, it's been difficult. I mean, 23, we sort of transitioned away from the COVID challenge and crisis. And there was, I think, a temporary period when we thought we were going to get more for our money. But then in the new environment with higher global prices for commodities, higher interest rates, I think fiscal space is actually shrinking. So I think that, and we haven't really seen yet any significant evidence of significant improvements in taxation, which is really key to UHC, universal health coverage. One thing I would flag, there has been in the past few months, I think, much more attention by the IMF and the World Bank to the importance of raising taxes. And in fact, a report just came out last month by the IMF showing that most developing countries, for example, in the Commonwealth, they can raise taxes by at least 5 or 6% of GDP, not by doing best practices, but simply raising what they do to the average levels of performance, particularly on policies and implementation in other similar countries. What I think, though, on the other hand, we haven't seen, I've been a bit disappointed, is, I think, increased efforts at the Commonwealth level, I think, to promote its thought leadership role in this issue. The Commonwealth has much rich experience on this kind of issues, and I think we should be doing more. Finally, on your last sort of sub-question about what can governments do to ensure better funding, I actually think that's the wrong question, to be honest. And I think it gets it the wrong way around, right? I mean, governments should respond to public pressure. In most of the Commonwealth, we have democratic societies, and taxes are ultimately a political issue and should reflect what voters want and how they just, assess the balance between taxes and spending. So it's not really what governments should do. I think it's really goes back to the voters. Here, I think the big challenge remains how and whether civil society stands up to generate the pressure to raise taxes to finance better social solidarity and health coverage. And that often doesn't happen. And I think, sadly, I'm just talking here about Sri Lanka, in my own country, we're a country with incredibly low tax collections, which has led to falling health budgets, huge damage to the health system. But in the past year, we've seen, I have to say, civil society really hasn't stepped up and added their voice to demand those higher taxes. And I think in that kind of context, where civil society, the voters are not willing to speak up, then I think it's really wrong, almost impossible to expect governments to respond. And I would just end, I was this morning in Colombo, I had a meeting with the leader of one of the major political parties in Sri Lanka, and I was discussing with them some of the issues. And I think it's really hard, I realized, to expect politicians to pursue a tax agenda to support better social protection when there's very little support for them outside in civil society and from voters. Thank you.
Thanks, Ravi. And speaking of the role civil society can play, Nuong, let me come to you as we shift to freedom of expression. We've seen this across the Commonwealth. Civil society is facing increased repression and challenges, especially when it comes to freedom of expression. And this is both from state and non-state actors. Quite interesting. But are there areas where there has been progress since last year, 2022, in terms of freedom of expression? And when you consider this, what issues need to be highlighted, especially as we look forward and move forward to CHOGM and the People's Forum next year?
I think some of the positive outcomes have been in early 2022, the government of Nigeria lifted a ban on Twitter. They had put that ban had been in existence for some 7 months. And so that was considered a very huge gain where freedom of expression is concerned. It should never have been banned in the first place, but we'll take the wins. When you look at digital spaces, for example, we realize that digital rights, there's been an uptick because there's increased awareness. There's a lot of advocacy, and there's been a lot of intellectual conversations on social spaces, Twitter, Facebook, etc. And this has helped to sensitize a lot of online users about their rights and there's been some improvements in protecting online freedom. In my country, Ghana, we now have a whole department that sees to that. They have their issues, but it's baby steps. There's been a lot of public awareness and activism, and that's helping to promote freedom of expression. And there's increased public awareness. There's a lot of activism also. But to be honest, the fact that we even struggle to find good examples of freedom of expression should tell us that there are many uncomfortable violations of freedom of expression. I don't have too much time, but we have experienced also some interesting disruptions in cyber security. We've seen internet blackouts in 2022. Burkina Faso, Sierra Leone, these countries have experienced blackouts, usually government motivated. And some of these actions are in response to civil unrest, which, I mean, government shouldn't be able to crack down on the internet just because the citizens have gone against government or pushed against government or protested, which is their right. We know that in Ethiopia, we still have media freedom coming under attack. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, in Rwanda, journalists are still operating under the watchful eye of authorities. They keep complaining. Even in my country, Ghana, you find that government often boasts about freedom of expression, reaching new and enviable heights, but there are civil society organizations within the country that will tell you they do not agree with these assertions and then point out many inaccuracies. So while freedom of expression is guaranteed in most of these countries, what we see is that the constitutions do guarantee freedom of expression, but you'll find that governments continue to undermine these freedoms using all kinds of tactics. And because individuals fear retribution, they fear threats, they fear arrest, they fear physical attacks. And so you find that they start to self-censor. Ghana, for example, we know has dropped on the press freedom ranking. It's the worst ranking it's had in over 20 years. So I could go on and mention more names and details, but we don't have that time. Now, in February 2022, for example, in Ghana, we've had civil society organizations such as the Center for Democratic Development, Imani Africa, Star Ghana. These are institutions that have been very active in pushing for freedom of expression, have put themselves out there to actively campaign for and even to go against government in some instances and hold government accountable. So we realize that these civil society organizations, because they're independent of government, have been very instrumental in pushing for positive examples of freedom of expression. Now, if I'll just look at some of the issues that need to be highlighted as we go forward and critically addressed, I'll say censorship and repression, because there are ongoing issues of censorship by governments and including restrictions on media outlets and journalists. In my country, for example, just in October, we had a situation where foot soldiers of the ruling government stormed into a media house, literally stopped the program that was going on because some of the panelists were discussing their party in a very bad light. They didn't want that. So the fact that they had the audacity to storm a program like that and actually stop the program from proceeding tells you the kind of things that are going on. So we have to look at these things. We have to critically examine political interference because it is the cause of most of the infractions against freedom of expression. We know that governments continue to attempt to influence media outlets and control narratives and undermine the independence of the press. I also think that we need to look at the funding of independent journalism, because these are usually the journalists who are less biased, are less able to be influenced, and are better able to tell the story with the right facts. We also have to promote more access to information. In my country, there's one positive example. We have the RTI Commission, but the problems they're facing over there also include that the commission is appointed by government. So will government appoint people that will actually do the job and be critical of government when need be? So the independence of these kind of institutions need to be further guaranteed. That's what I think we should be focusing on going forward.
Fantastic. Thank you for that contribution, Nuong. Tijani, let me come to you as we talk about Commonwealth reform. Now, you chaired the Commonwealth Youth Council between 2018 and 2022. And since then, what positive opportunities would you say have really opened up when it comes to reimagining the Commonwealth, especially through your work?
Okay, great. Thank you again, Victoria. I would say, just thinking back, first of all, it's not intended for me to be in position for 4 years. It really is supposed to be 2 years. But of course, COVID-19 extenuating circumstances. So to be clear, I was not a government in power that never wanted to leave. Definitely not. Since, I mean, we're talking about last year and coming now into this year, just a year or so has passed. And the major thing, to be honest, that really has been on people's mind coming out of, CHOGM, and particularly around what has been happening for young people, is really around the year of youth. And this year is that year of youth. But what is important is the commitment by governments to say in their own declaration statement that they are pronouncing this 2023 as the year of youth, and all celebrations, both on an international level or multilateral and at the local level, is going to be around this year of youth. And we've seen demonstration of these activities, particularly recently, the Commonwealth Youth Ministers meeting happened in London, where we had participation from, yes, decision makers in terms of youth ministers in the member state, but we also had the participation of a youth forum for young people themselves, because it's interesting, you could never have a youth ministers meeting and not have young people there. Seems a bit divorced from the issue, right? So one of the things that has been, at CYMM or SIM over the many years, and this is a stride that we've had over the years, and we've seen it continued within the progress on the year of youth, is that many people don't know that even the Commonwealth Youth Ministers meeting, which is a decision-making body around the thematic area of anything to do with young people, that do you know that normally in a heads meeting, you would have, member states equally have a voice in terms of speaking and voting. But in the Commonwealth Youth Ministers meeting, young people, particularly, there is a chair represented through the Commonwealth Youth Council that you have an equal say at the table, just as any other member state minister or youth. In a lot of multilateral organizations, that is an anomaly. You're invited, but it doesn't mean that you're at the table to speak. Maybe to do a guest presentation or speak on a panel, but not actively participating where your contribution is counted in equal weight with other member states. That is something that we've built on, and we see continue over the many years. And I've checked many multilateral systems, whether I've been a part of it or others. As I'm known, I'm very senior youth now, where we've seen that kind of, where we've not seen that kind of structure. And so the Commonwealth does have a strong legacy to build on. And so now the Year of Youth celebration is really just bringing all of that together with the Youth Ministers meeting, the Commonwealth Youth Award that is happening as well, and a lot of discussion series, both across the Commonwealth and at the Commonwealth level and at the different regional levels that are taking place. So a lot of moving parts. The bigger question is, beyond the Year of Youth, where do we go next with this? And of course, there is the 2024 CHOGM that we expect to happen in Samoa, which young people will have their own forum and their voices being heard there. So it's important that that mechanism, but one of the challenge we will have, and we have to make sure that it doesn't exclude anyone, is of course bringing them to the table. Of course, young people are the most disadvantaged when it comes to economic capital, not social capital, because of course, in terms of earning potential and what they have right now, a lot of youth organization and so forth, how to get to Samoa is going to be another question. Of course, the Commonwealth Secretariat has always, with Lane Robinson, the Social Policy Development team, have always played an active role where member states are not able to send representatives, try to step in as best as possible to make sure that someone from that country is there. So that is important, because it's one thing to have these meetings, but when you say you extend an invitation, come on, the resources are not the same. We are not equal partners as it relates to what we bring. So we have to make sure that, yes, invitation is to the table, but if the table is all the way in Samoa, you also need to help me with the airfare. So there's, all of that you have to really consider. So that would be what I think about in terms of what to see next in going to 2024 and going forward. But I think in terms of, definitely there is work to be done, but the legacy that we have and what we're standing on, I think it's very strong.
And we'll talk about that, Tijani, in terms of the work that needs to still be done when it comes to giving more of a voice to the youth. But Harjit, let's hop back on over to climate issues. You talked about some of the progress being made in the climate justice space over the last 8 months, the designing of the Loss and Damage Fund by the Transitional Committee. But, when you look at what more needs to be done, just as Tijani was saying, where should civil society focus their efforts in the lead up to CPF 2024 and really beyond that?
Absolutely. So immediately after COP27, where the decision on loss and damage was taken, so my words were that we are beginning to tackle the consequences of climate change, but not the cause, that is fossil fuels. The reality is that we continue to use and burn fossil fuels, which are intensifying the climate crisis. And all the recent reports, in fact, yesterday there was a UNEP emissions gap report saying how emissions continue to rise. And the fossil fuel use is going to multiply in the next few years, completely blowing the target of staying below 1.5 degree. The production gap report talked about how we are going to increase our production of coal, oil, and gas. So we are nowhere near tackling the cause of the problem. And that's going to be a big fight at COP28, because here is a chance. We are going to UAE, which is an oil-producing nation. We can strike a deal to talk about how we can phase out fossil fuels in a just and equitable manner. We know that many economies, Nigeria is a case in point, and we have countries like Timor-Leste or Azerbaijan, who are dependent on fossil fuels, not just for energy, but also for revenues. But whereas big countries like Canada, US, and UK have resources to move away. So we have to have a just and equitable approach to move away from fossil fuels, and rich countries have to provide finance. And that's the kind of deal that we are looking at here at COP28, where we want that decision that goes beyond Paris Agreement. We can develop a new global framework in the form of a fossil fuel treaty to complement Paris Agreement. So there are a number of ways that we can look at to develop a just transition plan to really move away from the addiction that we have to fossil fuels, and the vested interest of industry continues. So we have a lot more to do, and as civil society, we have to put this issue right front and center. We have to amplify the voices of frontline communities whose rights are being violated, not only because of the extraction, but when you burn, how it causes much more climate impact. So we need equitable climate policies. We need to rather support positive community-led solutions that are going to avert the crisis and help us adapt. And of course, we have to hold corporations accountable, and particularly the fossil fuel industry that has not allowed us to take action over the last 30 years. And their power is increasing because they're in bed with government. So this is a massive issue that we need to deal with to really help avert the crisis.
Ravi, Harjit talked about having more equitable climate policies. Let's talk about having more equitable health policies, if you will. We saw the recommendations from CPF 2022, and particularly from the Health Roundtable, and they called for better representation of women in international leadership roles and in the healthcare decision-making tables. What steps have been taken to ensure that women are better represented? And how can the Commonwealth leverage on its position and its reach to convene this kind of leadership?
Sure, Victoria. So let me try and quickly respond to that. I mean, I can't really report on any specific developments, again, the past 12 months. Although one I would flag from our part of the world was the election of Samia Wazed from Bangladesh as the new regional director for the Southeast Asia office at WHO. So I think that's been, I think, a very significant development of in terms of representation of women in major organizations. Now, however, I should give a caveat to this. If we're completely honest, this probably happened because her mother is also the Prime Minister of Bangladesh. And I think this really points to a bigger issue that if you look at most of the major political positions in the big agencies, they really reflect the earlier representation of women in national government leadership positions. So we've had many, I would say, national women who've risen to be heads of government go on to head many of these international agencies. So I think really the challenge for us is how do we get women into those positions at country level in order to create the opportunities for them to take those higher level positions or to lobby for other women to get into those positions. I think that's probably what we should focus on. I think one thing that maybe the Commonwealth can do, because this is a long-term process, is maybe it can maybe help, I think maybe upcoming women in some of those positions to go further. I mean, we have a number of women leaders from the Commonwealth who have gone on to hold major positions in international organizations. One person I can just recently I can think of is Mrs. Helen Clark from New Zealand, and in fact, there are others. I think that's maybe we need to find a way of getting them together to try and support women get into better representation in those positions. But I think that's going to be a long-term process, and I think ultimately, this all goes back to I think accountability, responsiveness, and I think it's the issue of democracy. I mean, democracy has often been the major driver that has enabled women to get into those positions. Certainly been true in South Asia, where I'm from, and I think that's something we need to continue protecting, and I think working incrementally over time to improve the representation of women.
Fantastic, fantastic. I need to thank my panelists for this session, Nuong, Harjeet, Tijani, and Ravi, as we segue into the second part of our conversation. We'll be hearing from frontline advocates, activists, and practitioners who will explore how local voices have been amplified in policy and decision-making spaces at the national, international, and Commonwealth level. And this is to achieve real progress in health, climate, freedom of expression, and Commonwealth reform, our 4 themes for this session. Now, let me quickly introduce our panelists for this particular conversation. Peace, Dr. Rispa Walumbe, a global health specialist with almost a decade of experience in advocacy and healthcare policy at a national, regional, and global level. She currently serves as a senior health policy advisor at Amref Health Africa, where she leads the UHC Delivery Lab and provides technical expertise on health financing and health policy. We also have Fatou Jang Senghor, a Gambian jurist and human rights advocate with over 20 years of experience in the nonprofit sector. She established and headed Article 19's West Africa office in Senegal and oversaw the organization's work in West Africa for over a decade. She recently founded the Center for Women's Rights and Leadership, a platform to advance women's rights, political participation, and leadership in the Gambia. And we also have Kavindya Tenakun, a Sri Lankan community development and youth activist. She is a recipient of the Queen's Young Leaders Award back in 2015. And she wrote an open letter to the Commonwealth institutions challenging them to acknowledge and speak about the shared colonial legacy of dominance, violence, and atrocity. We'll also hear from Brianna Fruin via a pre-recorded message that will start off the discussion for this part of the conversation. Now, let me tell you a little bit about Brianna. She's a Pacific climate activist from Samoa who has been leading grassroots community projects pushing for climate justice since she was a child. She is the first youth ambassador for the Secretariat of the Pacific Regional Environment Program and current youth representative on the Council of Elders for the Pacific Climate Warriors. Now, Brianna has been recognized for her role in amplifying the voices of young Pacific Islanders on the issue of climate change. She has used her platform to speak about hope and resilience in the midst of the climate crisis. And she has said that, and I quote, "We, Pacific youth, are not just victims to the crisis. We have been resilient beacons of hope. And Pacific youth have rallied behind the cry. We are not drowning. We are fighting. This is our warrior cry to the world," end quote. So we asked Brianna what key lessons and challenges she experienced in scaling up from local climate activism to becoming a global advocate for the Pacific, as well as how other young climate activists can scale their efforts and build their capacity to engage in decision-making spaces at both the local and global levels to drive meaningful change. Brianna, over to you.
One of the challenges I felt going from local climate work to global advocacy was trying to please everyone and doing advocacy the right way. And the reason why I found this such a challenge was because this is impossible. And I had to learn that. I had to learn that it was impossible to please every organization, please every civil society group, please every NGO or every government that I worked with, and did this advocacy the way they believe that activism should be. And I learned that different people had different theories of change, and that the easiest way for me to bypass this barrier was figuring out my own theory of change and doing the work personally to find out what my skills were. What did I bring to the table? It wasn't about what other people wanted me to bring to the table as a young advocate or what other people believed that I should say that would make an impact. It was about what I had to say, what I wanted to say that I believed could change the minds and the hearts of people. And so I had to really do some inner looking to find out that while I can write, I can speak, and I can organize. And those are the things that I could confidently do. And those three things are the things that I had to work on and I had to sharpen. And the way that I sharpened these was I found mentors that can help me write, mentors that help me prepare speeches and the ways in which I wanted to communicate the work that I was doing, and mentors that helped me become a facilitator, that helped me become a community organizer, that helped me become an online organizer. And so I think for young people who are looking for ways to build capacity, to scale up their efforts in global advocacy, I would really encourage them to find what their tools are, what they have in their toolbox that can assist this movement, and hone in on that, and don't make other people, or don't let other people tell you that shouldn't be your priority, or that's not the right way to be an activist, that's not the right way to be an advocate. There is no right way. You will not please everyone. You will not please every government nor every organization. You can only do you. And you can only do the things that you're able and you're wanting to do. And I think the easiest way to find this and to figure this all out is to seek out mentorship, to seek out the people who came before us, who can show us a path down the road that we believe change will be.
Fantastic reminder there of how you can effectively use your voice from Brianna. Kavindia and Rispa, I wanted to get your thoughts on Brianna's submission. I'm curious to hear from both of you about the strategies that have been most effective from where you sit in ensuring that the voices of young people like Brianna and women and local communities are heard and represented. Rispa, let me start with you, because I know during the Health Roundtable discussion, you mentioned that it's important to have sustainable consultation mechanisms at a community level. Expound more on that.
I think one of the key things that I've learned with time is that I firstly agree with Brianna that there's no right way. to do advocacy. And the reason why there's no right way is because given that things are changing, the tides are changing, it's important for us to be able to incorporate new ways of doing business, because we have to be able to be as responsive as possible to what the key needs of the communities that we're engaging with. And one of the ways we can actually sustain this process is by effectively collaborating with each other. And that collaboration really needs to be unpacked a lot more in terms of, we talk about silos a lot, but I don't know if we actually go into the details of what it means to unpack what being in a silo means and how to work outside with other collaborators and work effectively. And I think there's many examples of where change has been accelerated simply because of collaboration. And one of the first ways I could give an example is, for instance, even as we've discussed climate, we often discuss it separately from health, but actually they're quite intertwined, right? Because some of the consequences you see as a result of climate change are actually because of, some of the health outcomes that we see from a health perspective. And one of the advocacy points that have been made even from a climate perspective has been because of being able to package the problem from a health perspective. So looking at it from being able to access services and being able to access care. So I think when we talk about collaboration, it's really important for us to, one, collaborate across different civil society organizations, but also across sectors, which is something, again, we don't do very well, right? So really work across sectors, work across different organizations and institutions. But then also, I think in terms of the momentum that can really drive change, being able to leverage that collective action during those windows of opportunity, because the policy process is quite long and arduous. And if we are really looking to effect change, I think being able to identify those windows of opportunity and being able to effectively leverage them, those are two separate things. And I think working collaboratively is a really important answer to that. And then maybe just to add on, is really looking at how to identify small incremental steps, because often we want those big changes that we can shout from the rooftops. And anyone who's worked in advocacy for any length of time knows that those big announcements, it takes time, it takes a lot of effort, but it takes incremental steps. So I think looking at those incremental steps is where we actually even start to demonstrate success. And this is also where policymakers actually deeply engage, where we can actually start to be part of the process of demonstrating that success. And I hope that, let me
come in there because I want to bring in Kavinda. We're a bit short on time. Kavinda, I know when it comes to having the voices of young people, women heard, you've been very vocal about how youth often are engaged as a kind of monolith of people, not as individuals with their own areas of expertise. So speak more to that, if you would.
Yeah, thank you, Victoria. It's great to be here. And I want to kind of build on what Dr. Bispa was so eloquent to put together as well. I think the big question is, what does youth participation actually mean? I think I don't think I've ever attended. I think I attended CHOGM when it was in Sri Lanka, but afterwards I really haven't. Because for me personally, as someone who's kind of transitioned, I don't consider myself to be a young person anymore. I think we need to make space for others who are actually young. Because I feel like after you're 27, 28, that perspective of a young person, I think it goes away. And I think that's the reality. I think for me, that's the big question. Like, what does youth participation mean? Does bringing a bunch of amazing young practitioners or young people and activists into Rwanda to sit around in a table, what does that actually mean? Does that mean there is tangible resource and investment being put into the work that they're leading? Or, for example, if you're talking about representation of young people in parliament, are we actually putting money into the campaigns of young people? Yes, we're running workshops, but I don't think young people and women need workshops. They need tangible money and investments to run their campaigns. So that's just an example to ask, like, what does youth participation mean? Is it an outcomes document that sits as a PDF that's then read in the next year? So what's the value we put in the time that young people bring? I think that's one question. And I think the second thing is, I think in terms of scaling, I think one of the biggest barriers that I faced as someone who's more younger in the education space is incompetence among policymakers at very senior levels in parliament, in decision-making, governmental bodies, both kind of local at a country level and also regional. There's this massive divide between what's happening in the world in terms of technology, in terms of design innovations, versus the mindsets of people in policy. So kind of it's the swimming upwards battle. And now I'm in the technology space, so I feel like I've become so distant from kind of these development circles, because I feel technology and design communities have created these bubbles where we're implementing solutions and then trying to find alternate ways of scaling outside government bodies. I don't agree that's the best way to do it, but I feel like in the face of a lot of state level failure, I think technology is creating this alternate paths to finding solutions, testing them out and scaling, which has been interesting to see. So I think those are a couple of my thoughts about what does participation really mean. But yeah, Victoria, over to you again.
Fantastic. Thanks for that, Kavindya. And before I come to you, Fatou, let me circle back to RISPA. You had some great points on change and how it's an accelerator by collaboration across sectors, across organizations. But I want to hear from you, RISPA, because when you talk about examples where you've influenced policy changes, for instance, and decisions at national and international levels, I know you presented some key policies during the health ministers' meeting. Tell us more on some of the key areas that you raised during that time.
I think, so thanks again. And I think one of the things that's really important to look at when we're talking about the policy process is that, one, it's often a very black box that no one really is able to see into. It's only these kind of like shareholders of the policy process who tend to be engaged in that process. So again, it's long and arduous, but I think, again, I was talking about identifying policy windows. And the policy windows I'm talking about, I think especially as we reflect for the next year, there's three key things that have actually happened that I think would be important for the team here to recall. So firstly, when it comes to things like universal health coverage, there's actually a launch of a report on the global monitoring report for universal health coverage. And that report it reflects where are the pain points when it comes to this. The second thing that happened is we had the high-level meetings for universal health coverage, PPR, and TB. And then the third thing that happened is that at the World Health Summit, there was actually a launch of a community health delivery partnership. So I see all of these as actual opportunities. One, because they receive global recognition. That's one of the ways we can start to accelerate. Okay, what's the opportunity? What's the one incremental step? But also two, what kind of, how do I translate this into something that will happen at a local level? Because I think that's a challenge for local actors. When you look at these global things, it'll be really important to understand that all of these global pieces of work, it's about taking that global moment and understanding that the race to 2030 is on, right? And there is political mileage when it comes to that, because we have T-7 years. So how do we start to plan? How do we start to collaborate and plan around that? And I think, again, as we look towards CHOGM, that's an opportunity. And then finally, as I close, I think it's just around, I think Ravi mentioned what's happening in Kenya. That process actually took a really long time, right? Previous governments have been on the, talking about health insurance, and now we are seeing kind of like a clear process that's coming out. But that long journey actually started with, advocacy at the lower level, advocacy by local actors to be able to accelerate it. And now, again, another opportunity is how can local actors in that context actually inform the design of primary healthcare systems? Because that's something that is a priority for the government. So how do we inform that? How do we inform that with data and information and community experiences from the grassroots level as civil society? Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, RISPA, and reminding us of that policy journey that, yeah, it does start with local actors. Kavindya, let me come to you in terms of what you've done in your space in influencing policy change as well.
Yeah, I think I want to actually bring an example of a really interesting initiative that happened in sort of this tech education space. And I bring that because I work in education and that's the space I know best. And I'll tie that into a role that sort of the Commonwealth and this gathering could kind of contribute to. So one of the biggest issues that we've had in education is a lack of data. We don't know how big the problem is. We don't know how many schools are out there. We don't know the exact quality needs of these schools, from the number of toilets that are needed to be repaired to access to the internet, and so on. So there is this amazing initiative called GIGA. It's GIGA. I'm sure I see Dr. Rispa nodding. I'm sure people here are familiar with it. The reason why I bring that out is GIGA actually started as a startup, a tech startup. And the big problem was they wanted to connect schools to the internet. The big problem is technology access is great. We need children learning to code, to access information, to learn how to learn. But the biggest issue that schools have is access to the internet. However, getting schools connected to the internet, the big issue was the lack of data. We didn't know how many schools were out there in the world that weren't connected to the internet. So what happened was GIGA partnered with UNICEF, which is now, it's actually a program within UNICEF now. And they've already mapped 21 million schools across, I think, 136 countries to look at their internet needs. And they've already been able to connect around 5,500 schools in 20 countries to the internet. And this is kind of an example of how a very small startup looking at a very particular problem, connecting schools to the internet, which is connecting students to kind of a wealth of information, was a problem. And the issue of scaling was data. And then governmental agencies came in and said, let's scale this. I think that's that connection that CHOGM is very well placed to bridge between young people, scalable solutions, technology, but also bringing kind of these ministerial connections and saying, look, there are these amazing interventions that could be scaled in your countries. And here are the ministers in charge. And let's create a forum where we could exchange ideas. So that's just an example, and to show sort of that opportunity that we might have here to scale ideas that actually work. Because there are ideas and solutions out there, but scaling is the problem. But I'll stop there.
Absolutely. Fatou, let me bring you in. From your experience, you literally established a human rights network in West Africa from scratch. So how can civil society work with, mobilize a wider range of stakeholders, and particularly legal practitioners, to promote principles on freedom of expression?
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here to share. Yes, indeed, as you rightly said at the beginning, freedom of expression is very critical for human rights in general, for the protection, but also it's the right that individuals to hold their leaders to account, and also to enable them to participate in the public discourse, but also to push and participate for bigger change. And for that, you can see that many governments generally are hiding behind laws, policies to really frustrate freedom of expression and to ensure that, citizens do not have fully the enjoyment of this right. And mobilizing really to ensure that we promote and protect freedom of expression is kind of difficult but important. And in the region, generally, we've seen over the past years, I can say over the past 2 decades, that civil society have been leading in encouraging, pushing for those reforms to happen. If I look at issues around access to information laws, if you look at most of the countries that have access to information law, I think about 28 out of the 54 countries have access to information law now, and the majority are in the Commonwealth countries. And you see most of the initiatives are civil society led. Some of them are during transition, which makes it a little bit more difficult, more more easier because you are in the reform kind of mood, like the Gambia. In the past, you have countries like Liberia, Sierra Leone, where reforms were started and civil society played a critical role in pushing for those agenda. But also the important thing also to note is that these reforms take time. Governments will start, but sometimes it takes a decade to complete some of those reforms. And in most countries, some of these reforms have taken more than 20 years. And civil society sometimes, with the challenges of funding, with the challenges of also shrinking civic space, repression, sometimes it's very difficult for civil society to pursue. So I think it's important that we talk about mobilizing and also working with legal practitioners. What we've seen in most countries, legal practitioners generally come at the tail end. In most of these reform processes, civil society, media-related organization, and journalist organization are leading. But when it comes to litigation, that's where you see generally lawyers coming to the fore. But I believe that it is important to look at it in a holistic manner and encourage more legal practitioners to come on board and support this reform, because these are at the heart of democracy, at the heart of the protection of human rights. And if you don't have good laws, it's very difficult to nurture and get democracy to flourish. So my experience has been that, yes, civil society has been leading, but for the past 10 years, with shrinking civic space, more repression, and the conflicts around the region, civil society have been weakened. And we are seeing more regression than what we've seen in the early 2000s. So this is why I think this discussion is very timely, and it's important that we remobilize, we refocus, and we bring all the actors, especially the legal practitioners, to the fore so that we can try and complete the unfinished business. I can just give you an example of a few countries where reforms have been going on for the past 7 years. For example, the Gambia, as you all know, has been transitioning from dictatorship to democracy. There have been many progress, but a lot also needs to happen in terms of freedom of expression. We were able to get an access to information law 2 years ago. The government is in the process of setting up an access to information commission, but also the laws, the draconian media laws that have been enacted in the past 22 years are still in the books. And from time to time, they are used. And this also creates a lot of friction and a lot of tension because we are in a democratic space now. People express their views and participate more than before. But the laws that are governing them are still, the old laws that were used during the repressive regime. But
Right.
the other bit, maybe I'll conclude there, is that also we have a judiciary that is relatively independent and that also is adjudicating unfairly, and government have been sanctioned, especially in the area of freedom of expression. Few weeks ago, government have been asked to pay damages for arbitrary detention of a journalist. And I think these are also encouraging signs, but I think the bulk of the challenge is that reforms must happen and they must be completed in order
And speaking about reforms, Fatou, if I may jump in there, if you can briefly respond, because you talked about reform efforts taking a while, sometimes 20 years at a time. When you talk about the role of Commonwealth civil society, how do they better build resilience to sustain the long-term advocacy efforts, especially when it comes to freedom of expression? Just briefly before we move on.
Yeah, sure. I think it's important that we learn from each other, and also I think mobilize through networks and support each other. I think most African civil society are doing that, but I think with the wealth of knowledge within the Commonwealth, I think it's very important that we do more exchanges. I remember in the past that the Commonwealth Broadcasting Association was doing a lot of work in supporting countries really to reform their public service broadcasters. I don't know where we are today, but I think these are very important because one of the key reforms that are stalling also is the reform of public service media. In most countries, public service media remain the mouthpiece of government, and we know how important for national unity, for democracy, but also for accountability, public service media is in the democratic landscape, but also as an independent media. So I believe that yes, working together in terms of networking, sharing best practices, learning from each other, but also working with the lawyers for the reforms, sharing briefs, and also helping for the drafting. And lastly, also when it's needed, also supporting each other for litigation would be also critical. And I think the Commonwealth, in which different organs can play a critical role.
On that note, thank you all for our participants and speakers who made your contributions and insights. Please continue contributing to the Google Docs, which will remain open for a further 2 hours after the event is over, and the post-event survey that will be circulated via email as well. In the coming year, we will embark on a series of regional conversations designed to provide a structured and inclusive space for Commonwealth civil society to delve deeper into a shared vision for the People's Forum. We'll be using your contributions from this event to help shape the regional conversations as well as the content for the forum in 2024. Together, we'll ensure that the People's Forum is inclusive, is vibrant, and impactful as possible. The first regional conversation will take place on the 6th of February, so mark your calendars. Keep an eye out on the Commonwealth Foundation's website and make sure you are signed up to the Foundation's mailing list for more details. So let's continue with this exciting journey towards Samoa together. Also, if you've not signed up already, we encourage you to join the Foundation's digital discussion platform. And this is an innovative online discussion space for activists, practitioners, for artists, and civil society leaders to network, share ideas, and build solidarity around the issues that we've discussed today. The link to join will be shared in the chat shortly, so keep an eye out for that. We'd also love for you to continue the conversation on social media, on Twitter, and on Instagram at Commonwealth.org. Once again, that's at Commonwealth.org. And to close this event on a powerful and inspiring note, we'll play a poem from the poet Audrey Brown Pereira, who is of the Cook Islands and of Maori and Samoan descent. If you were at CPF 2022, you'd remember this particular poem. For now, thank you all for joining and contributing. Goodbye for now.
They're taking pictures of us in the water. On the count of 1.5, smile, say cheese. They're taking pictures of us in the water like we are mermaid, wearing white coral and motherless plankton, quilted, illuminous, mysterious, not of this world. They post and share. Submerged still life, just breathing, visible and muted. The sea just below our nose, inhaling water. Islands become mythology, tragedy, and self-rescue in the making, but no myth, no ruins or philosophers of brilliance. Modern-day man want, need, find, take, make, break, throw away and leave behind. Promissory notes in faraway chapeau of negotiated text and international law and science and diplomacy. And make-believe. So we doubt and forget. Make-believe modern-day man not responsible when he the only one eating at the table. Weather patterns changing, harvest times too. Sea become terrestrial, so terrestrial becomes sea. Cannibal-induced climate, climate-induced cannibalism. Ice cream elsewhere be melting. And the living and the sea getting so hot, so hot, so hot. They tired, they hungry, they can't say in front of them. They don't know yet. 30 million square kilometers of our blue Pacific. Brown and black and white and gray. Birthing, breathing, being. We people not a mermaid. We leading the charge for our own self-rescue. Without us, there is no memory of the beginning, middle, or the end. There is nothing. On the count of 1.5, smile. You're not smiling.